I'm only happy when it rains. I'm only happy when it's complicated. And though I know you can't appreciate it, I'm only happy when it rains.
Britain is one of the richest countries in the world. National wealth has more than doubled in 30 years, and yet a report signed by parliamentarians from all parties finds a Britain where hunger stalks the land, people scavenging, 4 million at risk of simply not having enough to eat. The report says the UK's poorest have fared less well than those in many developed Western countries, hit by the rising cost of essentials. Here, food has gone up 47% in a decade. In Germany, it's just 22%. With housing, rents here are up 30% in 10 years. In Germany, it's 12%. And while fuel costs in Britain rose 154%, in Germany, it was half that. Just a short walk away from the gold and ermine opulence of the Palace of Westminster is a food bank. One of hundreds attempting to lift citizens free of hunger in what the report calls a social Dunkirk.
Shocking. The word used by the Archbishop of Canterbury to describe people in this country queuing for food handouts. Justin Welby today launched a report called Feeding Britain, which both charts the spectacular growth of food banks and sets out a plan to eliminate the need for them by the end of the decade. Though the report has cross-party backing, it did criticise the coalition's tough sanctions regime for benefit claimants. Today's report also prompted the Conservative peer Lady Jenkins to say that poor people go hungry because they can't cook. She later apologised. In a moment, we'll hear from people who've had to use food banks. But first, our economics editor, Paul Mason, is here. Paul, what have the MPs found?
Well, Jackie, this cross-party group of MPs is, of course, unofficial, but with massive, clout, because the Archbishop of Canterbury is leading the line for them. Now, what they've done is focus on what happened and what has happened to the poorest tenth of society, something we don't often hear about because of all the squeezed middle rhetoric. For example, one of the things they found is that the amount of their income such people spend on heating, food and housing is 40%. That's up from under a third just 10 years ago. And that's because we've got some of the highest food inflation and some of the highest energy inflation in the Western world. But that long-term picture is sharpened and exacerbated by what's been happening in the benefit system.
Yes, and the government has released new figures on benefit sanctions today.
Yeah, under a Freedom of Information request, they revealed that in the last fiscal year, 900,000 people, so nearly 1 million people, got sanctioned. That means you lose at least 4 weeks' worth of your benefit if you don't comply with the conditions. Half of them were under the age of 30. And if you put this into long-term context, this is what's been happening. This, say the campaigners, is the background to the rise of food banks. Because there's the year 2000, there's now, and towards the end of the Labour government, and certainly throughout the coalition, you've got a massive rise in the use of sanctions. Today, the government basically said, well, we're not going to change that, that's the regime, but they will change the communications that come to you if you're on job seekers allowance and you break the rules. You'll find out earlier. The opposition, and in fact the Liberal Democrats also, want to change this and basically go to what they call a yellow card system for people who don't meet the strict benefit rules.
What kind of people need food banks? People like June do.
It gives you the essentials to survive, and that's the key thing. So I think when you're in that situation where you basically have bare nothing, anything will do.
June was made redundant from a good job. Mum to Elijah, benefits don't stretch.
There's been times where he's just had to have beans on toast and I've had to have nothing because there's only one kind of beans and you don't have a penny to your name.
It says something that this food bank is open 7 days a week. It comes to something when we need a parliamentary inquiry into hunger in the UK. These MPs and church leaders say we have to pay people a living wage, stop energy companies ripping them off, give their kids more free school meals, because at the moment people can't afford ordinary life.
Well, they don't just walk in off the streets. People have to be referred here. Usually it's through a GP or social services. But if people with a real need come here, the church can actually give out vouchers. And I've got one here. They present this voucher to us and it says who's referring them.
So that really is the ticket?
That sort of is the entrance ticket. They don't come week after week. This is intended for crisis, so for maybe 2 or 3 visits while people are waiting for benefits.
Paul Taylor had to wait 3 months for benefits to start.
Well, I wouldn't want anyone I knew to see me rifling through the bins, you know what I mean? That is embarrassing, but it has to be done. One of the things you lose, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'd say it's rather an advantage of being homeless. I would be prepared to do things that you wouldn't dare do.
Today's report says problems with benefits are the single biggest reason people end up at food banks.
45% of the people that we help say that the primary reason they're there today, the crisis, is caused by a benefit delay or a change in the way benefits are being administered.
Today, the Work and Pensions Secretary Ian Duncan-Smith said government will look at late payments and raise awareness about interim help. John Fenlon is happy for people to know he went to a food bank.
Hi, John.
Hello, Jane.
Not that he felt that way last Christmas when there were bailiffs at the front door and nothing in the fridge.
We sat outside for about 15-20 minutes, didn't know whether to go in or not. I mean, honestly, it was like a sheer panic. And
What was stopping you going in?
pride, I think. It just literally, I couldn't bear to go in there and put my hands out and ask for food. It was really, really, really hard. And we just couldn't believe it. I was in tears when they brought it out. I thought, no.
What was hardest, declaring yourself bankrupt or walking into that food bank?
Walking into the food bank. I mean, I was, you know, why would I have to do that? I was working. I mean, I was earning money. But the trouble is, with the debts we had, we just couldn't buy the food. Everything was going on rent and bills. I think we ended up with about £20 a month left.
500,000 children live in families that can't afford to feed them, the report says. This brother and sister in Wiltshire say they can go without proper meals for days on end.
I can last a week without eating.
She never eats at all, hardly. I have to eat because I had a job. I need to eat because otherwise I'll be collapsing. I collapsed at work once because we had nothing to eat.
Today's report says it doesn't want to point the finger at any particular institution, but does say that Britain's welfare system is complicated, cumbersome and not fit for purpose. Benefit delays are causing considerable hardship, and the inconsistent use of sanctions means that vulnerable groups can be left without any money at all for weeks or even months.
Today, Conservative peer Baroness Jenkin rather clumsily suggested people were hungry because they can't cook.
Poor people don't know how to cook. And I mean, I had a large bowl of porridge today, it cost 4p. A large bowl of sugary cereals will cost 25p.
She's apologised since, but June, like many, was offended.
It's like saying you can buy a pack of meat and a pack of, you know, spaghetti and make a meal out of that, but that can only last a couple of days, and we don't even have enough money to buy that in the first place. So that statement is kind of absurd.
So for you, the problem wasn't that you didn't know how to cook, it's that you didn't have the food to cook with.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, you know, when you don't have a means to anything, you can't make an ends to it.
Well, joining us now, the food blogger Jack Monroe, who made her name with a blog, A Girl Called Jack, which gives ideas for feeding a family on a budget. And from the right-wing think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Philip Booth. Philip Booth, first of all, from your perspective, how do you view the food bank issue?
I really view it not through the prism of food banks or through the prism of benefits, but a prism of a severe cost of living crisis, and in particular the huge cost of housing, which can take 30 to 50% of the income of low-paid people, which is purely a policy-driven problem arising from restrictions on the planning system, which have just caused the price of housing to, well, more than double in real terms over the last 20 or 30 years.
So money that a poor family is using on rent, for example, is being extracted from their food budget, and then they have to go to the food bank.
Absolutely, and perhaps more importantly, it means, as the report said, they can't build up any buffers, any savings for hard times, whereas in past generations, even people on low incomes would have had some savings so that when they hit hard times, they could have used those savings to deal with their difficulties.
So as somebody who's actually managed to live on 70p, how do you view the debate today? I mean, is it possible to live well on very, very little?
Well, that's quite a simplistic way of looking at it, and I find quite often people say, well, if only like Baroness Jenkins said today. If only poor people cooked or ate a little better, then of course they'd be able to manage their finances better. But it's not always that simple. I mean, some social housing builds now only have a microwave and a shelf to store your food in. So it's all very well saying you can buy cheap ingredients and cook well on a low budget. But if you don't even have the facilities to do that in the first place, let alone the skills, then you're faced with some quite large problems. So I think people being unable to cook is a small part of the debate, but it's inarguably part of the debate, but it's a very small part of the debate.
I wonder how many food banks actually provide porridge.
Well, it depends what
Because
gets
after all,
donated to
that's
them.
possibly the most holistic imaginable, and you could probably cook that on a microwave. I mean, you put
Yeah, you
the
can
water in it.
you can do porridge in a microwave. I've written about it on my blog, but I think it's to focus solely on Anne Jenkins' comments is to take away from actually quite a detailed report that gives quite a lot of strategies for feeding people well on a low income. And well, I mean, by all accounts, one of the recommendations in the report is to run cooking courses. The Trussell Trust Food Banks already run Eat Well, Spend Less courses in an attempt to educate people to cook well on a low budget, but it's not the only and certainly not the major part of the debate.
I mean, do you not think that a food bank, in any case, breeds dependency?
Not especially, and in fact, food banks I regard as a charitable and caring response to a whole range of complex problems. Some of them may be people with a long-term cost of living difficulty, that their benefits or their income from work are below their living costs. Other people may have very complex problems which prevent them from working, and the advantages of organisations like food banks, as opposed to a welfare bureaucracy, is that a food bank can develop a relationship between the giver and the receiver, if necessary, and they can refer them to, often they're connected to churches, they can refer them to other organisations which may be able to deal with deeper underlying problems.
But in an IEA view of the world, a food bank would not be something you'd want to see.
In an IEA, well, in any view of the world, we don't want to see people who are unable to feed themselves. And I'd rather see the poor much better off. And I think if we had a different policy environment, the poor would be much better off. But there will always be people who fall on hard times for reasons which can't be helped either by government or as far as themselves or their families are concerned, who might have quite complex problems. And I think these are often best dealt with by organisations on the ground rather than by government bureaucracies.
And you'd probably agree with that?
Not so much, actually, because about half of the people referred to food banks cite benefit delays and sanctions as the reason that they're there. So although you're saying that government bureaucracy isn't the answer and the welfare state isn't the answer, perhaps if the benefits system worked a little better and people weren't having their benefits delayed, changed, cut, sanctioned, then they wouldn't be there in the first place. And that's true for nearly 50% of people who are referred to food banks. So although there are people with complex needs, people who've fallen on hard times, people like myself who've left a well-paying job for childcare problems, half the people referred to food banks are there because of sanctions, cuts and delays to their benefit, and we can't ignore that because that's quite possibly the largest part of the debate.
But the debate is being carried out by people who've never experienced a food bank. And by people who will never experience it.
But
there is a
they've
disconnect.
sought over 1,000 pieces of evidence from those people over a course of a year. I mean, I myself gave quite an emotional account to the all-party parliamentary group of my experiences, and they've sat and they've documented that in reports and reports, and they can't fail to listen to that evidence because it's all there in the report.
The Chancellor, George Osborne, has defended his plans to impose further cuts on public services, saying they're a price that works for our country.
Take 4 years of austerity, add another 4, subtract £55 billion worth of spending cuts, and what do you end up with?
Job cuts, pay cuts, service cuts. Is that wrong?
Well, I am absolutely straight with people that we're going to have to make savings in government departments, that we're going to have to cut certain welfare bills like benefits that go to working age people, but the prize is economic stability, growth, jobs in the future, a brighter future for Britain. I think that is a price that works for our country.
But he's much more reluctant to spell out the consequences of his own planned cuts.
Now, you say that people should be straight with the public. Are you going to be straight? Let's test it. Do you agree with the Office for Budget Responsibility that there could be 1 million jobs in the public sector lost?
Well, jobs have already had to go. And if we go on taking what I think are realistic decisions on public sector pay, then we can afford to have people in sufficient numbers in the public sector to do the jobs we ask of them.
You say realistic about pay. You are talking, are you not, about real pay cuts for every public sector worker for at least another 4 years?
But this country has to live within its means. We have to have a government we can afford.
Code is deputy now says for policies that are harsh, doctrinaire and certain to inflict unnecessary pain.